The human ambassador walked right past me. No scan, no search, no biometric verification. She just walked through a separate corridor I had never noticed before, and not a single guard moved to stop her. I opened my mouth to call it in. My hand was already reaching for the alert panel on my security console, when my supervisor grabbed my arm and pulled me backward so hard I nearly fell off my stool. "Do not," Dren said. His voice was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes from genuine fear. "Do not touch that panel." I stared at him. Dren was a Torvorn, broad-shouldered, thick-skinned, a veteran of 30 years in the Council's Protocol Enforcement Division. I had never seen his hands shake before. They were shaking now. "She bypassed every checkpoint," I said. "She did not even slow down. That is a Class 3 security violation. I have to report it." Dren released my arm and looked at me with an expression I could not read. It was something between pity and exhaustion, as if I had just asked him why we breathe or why stars burn. "Come with me," he said. "Now." He led me to a storage room behind our station, closed the door, and leaned against it like he was bracing for impact. "Listen to me carefully, Keth. Humans do not go through security. They never have, not in my lifetime here. They walk through that corridor, and they enter the council chamber, and nobody stops them, and nobody questions it, and if you value your career and your safety, you will never raise this issue again." I felt my throat tighten. Everything I had been taught in my training, every procedure, every regulation, every principled lecture about the absolute equality of security enforcement, all of it was being contradicted by my own supervisor in a storage room that smelled like chemical cleaner and old packing material. "That does not make sense," I said. "The entire purpose of this division is to ensure that no species receives preferential treatment. If one delegation can bypass screening, then the system is compromised. Any delegate could be carrying a concealed weapon into the chamber." Dren stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something move behind his eyes. It was the look of a man choosing between two bad options. "Keth," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "I have worked this post for 30 years. I have processed more than 11,000 delegations through security. I have confiscated weapons from species you have never heard of, and disabled implants that could have leveled this building. I know what a security threat looks like, and I am telling you, with everything I have learned in 3 decades of this work, that the humans walking through that corridor, without being screened, is not a failure of our security system. It is the most important security measure in this entire building." He would not explain further. He told me to go back to my station, process my delegations, and forget what I had seen. Then he left the storage room and returned to his post as though nothing had happened. I went back to my station. I did not forget. "My name is Keth Vorani. I am Selthari." I had been assigned to the Protocol Enforcement Division exactly 9 days before that morning. It was supposed to be a prestigious rotation, one that would look excellent on my administrative record. The Galactic Council's security apparatus was the most sophisticated in known space. Every species that entered the chamber submitted to a comprehensive screening process. Bioscans checked for concealed weapons, chemical agents, explosive compounds, and biological contaminants. Implant dampeners neutralized cybernetic enhancements, and psionic inhibitors suppressed telepathic and telekinetic abilities. Armed guards from 6 different species maintained overlapping fields of coverage at every entrance point. No exceptions. That was the first thing they taught us in orientation. The Council's security protocols were absolute and universal. Except they were not. I spent the rest of that shift watching the security feeds with new eyes. The human delegation consisted of 7 individuals. They arrived together, passed through a wide, well-lit corridor on the east side of the building, and entered the chamber through a door I had somehow never registered before. No cameras covered their corridor. No guards stood at their entrance. They were not logged in the daily screening manifest. It was as if they did not exist in the security system at all. I tried asking other clerks about it during the mid-shift break. The Oranai officer at Checkpoint 6 changed the subject so quickly, I thought he had misheard me. The Belvon technician in the monitoring room told me he did not know what corridor I was talking about, and then refused to make eye contact for the rest of the day. A Kelvari clerk who had been friendly with me since my first morning suddenly remembered an urgent errand and left the break room without finishing her meal. Nobody would talk about it. Nobody would even acknowledge that there was something to talk about. The silence itself was informative. This was not ignorance. These people knew something, and whatever they knew had sealed their mouths with a force more effective than any confidentiality agreement. I went home that evening with my mind racing. I had spent my entire career in administrative services believing that systems operated on logic. Rules existed for reasons. Exceptions were documented and justified. Anomalies were errors waiting to be corrected. The idea that a fundamental irregularity could exist at the heart of the galaxy's most important governing body, not as a mistake but as deliberate policy, was something I could not reconcile with the world as I understood it. That night in my quarters, I pulled up the Council's public records. I did not eat dinner. I did not check my personal messages. I sat at my terminal and began searching with the focused intensity that my species is known for, the same systematic thoroughness that had earned me this rotation in the first place. I searched for any resolution, any amendment, any procedural note that might explain why one species out of more than 300 was exempt from the most fundamental security requirement in galactic governance. I found nothing. The exemption was not listed anywhere. It was not referenced in any protocol manual, any training document, any administrative guideline. As far as the official record was concerned, humans went through security just like everyone else. But they did not. I had watched it with my own eyes. I started cross-referencing dates. If there was an exemption, it had to have been authorized at some point. Resolutions left traces even when they were classified. Budget allocations shifted. Construction permits were filed. Personnel assignments changed. I worked backward through 4 decades of administrative data, looking for anomalies, and I found one. 40 years ago, within a span of 3 standard days, the Council had done something unprecedented. An emergency session had been called with less than 1 hour of notice. Every senior delegate had attended. Not most. Not a quorum. Every single one. The session had lasted 9 hours without a recess, which was itself unheard of. And at its conclusion, a resolution had been passed with a classification level I had never encountered before. It was sealed under something called Protocol Sigma, which my clearance did not even allow me to identify, let alone access. The only label attached to the file was a date and 2 words: Veshon Incident. I searched for those words in every database I could reach. Military records, diplomatic archives, historical indices, news repositories. Nothing came back. Whatever had happened, it had been scrubbed from the public record with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. Even the search logs showed that nobody had queried those terms in over a decade, as though the entire galaxy had agreed to forget something that I was only now discovering had happened at all. The next morning, I made a decision that would cost me 3 days of sleep and fundamentally change my understanding of the galaxy I lived in. I went looking for someone who had been there. The Protocol Enforcement Division had been operating continuously for over a century. Staff rotated in and out, but institutional knowledge accumulated in the people who stayed longest. I pulled personnel records and found what I was looking for. Suvan, a Melori archivist, had been working in the Council Building's records department for 62 years. She had been there before the Veshon incident, during it, and for every day since. I found her in a subterranean archive 3 levels below the main chamber, surrounded by data crystals that predated digital storage. She was small and pale, her bioluminescent skin flickering softly as she cataloged entries that no one had requested in decades. "I know why you are here," she said without looking up. "You are the new clerk, the Selthari. You saw the humans walk through, and Dren told you to be quiet. And you cannot be quiet because you are young, and the irregularity offends your sense of order." I stood in the doorway and said nothing. She was exactly right. "Sit down," she said, and closed the door. I sat across from her at a work table covered in crystal shards and old manifests. She studied me for a long moment, her luminescent patches cycling through shades of amber and pale violet that indicated deep contemplation in her species. "Before I tell you anything," she said, "I need you to understand something. What I am about to share with you is not classified because it is politically sensitive. It is not classified because it is embarrassing to any delegation. It is classified because the information itself is dangerous. Not the events, the understanding. Do you follow the distinction? I told her I did, though I was not sure that was true. She leaned forward. How much do you know about humans? I told her what I knew, which was not much. Humans were a relatively recent addition to the galactic community. Their homeworld was a mid-sized rocky planet in a nondescript system on the outer arm of the galaxy. They had developed interstellar travel within the last century, largely by adapting technology they had acquired through early contact with a Belvan trading expedition. They were considered a minor species, unremarkable physiology, no psionic abilities, no cybernetic integration, no venomous defenses, no natural armor. By galactic standards, they were soft, fragile, and unimpressive. Suvan listened to my summary and then did something that unsettled me more than anything else that had happened in the last 2 days. She laughed. It was a quiet, brittle sound, and it carried no warmth at all. Soft, she repeated. Fragile. Unimpressive. She said each word like she was tasting something bitter. That is what the Veshan thought too. I waited. She looked at me, and her bioluminescence went completely still. In Mellory body language, that was the equivalent of a scream. I will tell you what happened, she said. But not here. We need a shielded room. No recording devices. No data connections. What I am going to tell you cannot exist in any system. It can only exist in your memory, and you will have to decide what to do with it. We moved to a communications dead room on the 4th sublevel, a space designed for sensitive diplomatic negotiations. The walls were lined with signal-absorbing material. There was no network access. There were no monitoring devices. We were as alone as 2 people could be, inside the most surveilled building in the galaxy. Suvan sat down heavily and folded her hands on the table. The light from her skin had dimmed to its lowest setting, barely enough to cast shadows. She looked old in that moment, older than her years, as though the weight of what she carried had been pressing her down for 4 decades, and she was only now letting someone see the strain. 40 years ago, she said, humanity had been part of the Council for only 7 galactic years. They were new. They were quiet. Their delegation was small, usually no more than 5 or 6 representatives, and they participated in debates the way a student participates in a lecture. Carefully, respectfully, taking notes, asking questions that were often surprisingly insightful, but never forceful. She paused. The Vishan Dominion saw them as prey. The Vishan Dominion, she explained, was a military coalition of 3 species that had dominated their sector of the galaxy for centuries. They were conquerors by tradition and temperament, and they maintained their influence through a combination of economic pressure and strategic intimidation. Their combined fleet was the largest in the galaxy outside the Council's own peacekeeping force. They had colonized over 400 worlds, and they governed their territory with an iron discipline that tolerated no dissent and no independence. They had been watching humanity since first contact, and they had identified Earth's solar system as a valuable strategic position. The system sat at the intersection of 3 major trade routes that connected the galactic core to the outer rim territories. Whoever controlled that intersection controlled the flow of commerce and military logistics across an entire quadrant. The Vishan did not want Earth, Suvan clarified. They did not care about the planet or its resources or its people. They wanted the space around it, the orbital lanes, the jump points, the strategic geometry. Earth's system was a key that unlocked a door they had been trying to open for generations. Their initial approach had been diplomatic, in the way that a predator circling its target is diplomatic. They offered humanity a protective integration into the Dominion's sphere of influence, military protection, trade access, technological assistance, all in exchange for sovereignty over Earth's orbital space and the right to establish military installations within the system. The human government declined. Politely but firmly, the Dominion offered again, with better terms. The humans declined again. The Dominion offered a 3rd time, with terms that were essentially an ultimatum. The humans declined a 3rd time. The Veshan were not accustomed to being refused. They decided to force the issue, Suvan said. Not through open military action, That would have triggered council intervention. Instead, they pushed for what they called a security containment protocol, a council resolution that would strip humanity of its sovereign status and place Earth's system under Dominion military administration, ostensibly for the safety of galactic shipping lanes. The motion had traction. The Veshan had spent years building alliances, trading favors, and applying pressure to neutral blocks. Several species owed them military debts. Others feared their fleet. The vote was scheduled for 2 sessions away, and preliminary counts suggested it would pass. The human delegation knew what was coming, Suvan said. Ambassador Catherine Hale had been lobbying against the motion for weeks, but she was one voice in a chamber of 700, and the political math was against her. Then, the Veshan escalated. 3 days before the vote, Catherine Hale's delegation arrived at the council building to find their credentials had been invalidated. A system error, they were told. It would be corrected shortly. While they waited, their quarters were reassigned to a maintenance sublevel. Their communication equipment was confiscated under a fabricated contraband charge, and their access to the council's diplomatic network was suspended pending review. They were being isolated, cut off from their government, their allies, and the council apparatus that might have protected them, and they knew it. Catherine Hale protested through official channels, Suvan said. She filed complaints, she requested hearings, she did everything that a diplomat is supposed to do when their rights are being violated. And every request was delayed, redirected, or lost in administrative processing. The Veshan had people in the bureaucracy. It was methodical. I asked what happened next. Suvan's bioluminescence flickered, and I saw her hands tighten on the edge of the table. On the second day, the Veshan stopped pretending, she said. A Veshan military officer, a commander named Torek, arrived at the maintenance sublevel, where Catherine Hale and her 4 aides were being held. He brought 41 soldiers in full tactical armor. They sealed the room, activated a dampening field, and Torek told the ambassador that she was not leaving until she signed a territorial concession, giving the Dominion access to Earth's system. 5 humans, I said, against 41 soldiers in powered armor. Suvan nodded. What happened? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. Her light had gone completely dark now. In the dead room, without her bioluminescence, I could barely see her face. What happened, she said slowly, was reconstructed from security footage, structural damage reports, and medical records. None of the Veshan guards were able to give coherent testimony afterward. Most of them could not speak for several days. Some of them never returned to active military service. She placed a small data chip on the table between us and slid it toward me with one trembling finger. I copied the security footage before they sealed the archive, she said. I have kept it for 40 years because I believe someone in every generation should know the truth. Not the rumor, not the legend, the truth. She stood up and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back and looked at me one final time. You asked why humans enter the council unarmed, and no one questions it, she said. Watch the footage, then you will understand. She left. I sat alone in the dead room, with the data chip in my hand, and felt the floor of my understanding shift beneath me. I took the chip home, I loaded it into a standalone terminal with no network connection, and I pressed play. I did not sleep for 3 days. The footage was split into multiple feeds, captured from security cameras positioned in a conference room on the diplomatic level of the council building. The room was large, designed for negotiations between delegations of up to 50 individuals. The timestamp placed the recording exactly 40 years, 2 months, and 11 days before the morning I had watched the human ambassador walk past my checkpoint. The quality was sharp. Council security cameras recorded in full spectrum, capturing visual, thermal, and electromagnetic data simultaneously. I could see everything. Every face, every movement, every weapon. The Veshan soldiers were arranged in a standard containment formation. 3 ranks, staggered positions, overlapping fields of coverage. Textbook military procedure. Their armor was the heavy tactical variant, plated composites rated for kinetic projectile impacts and energy weapon discharge. Each soldier carried a sidearm on the right hip and a close-quarters suppression rod magnetized to the left thigh plate. The room's dampening field was active, indicated by a subtle blue shimmer along the walls. The 5 humans stood at the far end of the room. Ambassador Catherine Hale was in the center, a woman of average height, with dark hair pulled back from her face. She wore a formal diplomatic uniform, dark fabric, with subtle insignia at the collar. Nothing about her appearance suggested physical danger. To her left stood her chief aide, a tall man named Philip Grant. To her right, a woman identified in the file as Laura Simmons, listed as a cultural attaché. Behind them, 2 more aides, Edward Cole and Margaret Webb. None of them were armed. They had nothing. No weapons, no tools, no communication devices. 5 unarmed civilians in formal clothing, surrounded by 41 soldiers in powered armor, in a sealed room with active containment measures. Commander Torek stood directly in front of Catherine Hale, close enough that his shadow covered her entirely. He held a data tablet in one hand and a stylus in the other. The audio feed was clear enough for my translator to process every syllable. "Ambassador Hale," Torek said, "your species has been offered reasonable terms for integration into the Dominion's protective sphere. Your government's continued refusal to accept these terms has created an unnecessary complication. I am authorized to resolve that complication here and now." Catherine Hale looked up at him. She was less than half his mass. The top of her head barely reached the midpoint of his chest plate. The thermal overlay showed her body temperature at a steady baseline. No elevation, no fluctuation. "Resolve it how, Commander?" she said. Her voice was calm. Not the careful calm of someone managing their emotions. Calm in the way that still water is calm. Calm because there was nothing beneath the surface to disturb it. "You will sign the territorial concession," Torek said. "You will authorize the Dominion's military access to your system. You will do this now. You will not leave this room until it is done." Catherine Hale did not look at the soldiers. She did not look at the weapons or the dampening field or the sealed door. She looked at Torek's face, the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that is blocking a hallway, not with anger, not with fear, with the mild assessment of someone calculating how to move an obstacle. "And if I decline," she said. Torek leaned closer. I could hear the servomotors in his armor, adjusting to the shift in his weight. "You are contained, Ambassador. Your communications are severed. Your government does not know where you are. My soldiers have standing orders to prevent your departure by any means necessary. You have no leverage. You have no allies in this room. You have no options." I watched Catherine Hale's face on the recording. I watched it very carefully, because what happened next would have been incomprehensible without seeing the moment it began. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not shift. Her breathing did not quicken. But something behind her eyes moved, something subtle and fundamental, like a switch being thrown in a circuit that I could not see but could somehow feel through the screen. She looked to her left at Philip Grant, then to her right at Laura Simmons, then over her shoulder at Edward Cole and Margaret Webb. Each of them met her gaze. Each of them gave the smallest movement of acknowledgement, barely a nod, more like a settling, the way a structure settles when weight is applied evenly across its supports. Then Catherine Hale looked back at Commander Torek and gave a single nod. The timestamp on the recording marked the next 11 seconds with clinical precision. I watched those 11 seconds more than 30 times over 3 sleepless nights. I slowed them down to frame-by-frame advancement. I mapped trajectories, calculated velocities, cross-referenced impact points with the medical records I found buried in the same sealed archive. And I still could not fully process what I was seeing. Laura Simmons moved first. She was listed in the delegation's public file as a cultural attaché, a civilian specialist in interspecies communication protocols. She was not large. She was not visually imposing. She was a woman of medium build in a diplomatic uniform carrying nothing but her own body. She closed the distance to the nearest Veshan soldier in less time than it took me to register the motion on the first viewing. On the slowed replay, I could track her movement, and it was precise in a way that seemed almost mechanical. Not the desperate scramble of someone fighting for survival. The controlled efficiency of a body performing a function it was designed to perform. Her right hand found the join between the nearest soldier's helmet and chest plate. There was a gap of perhaps 2 centimeters at that junction, a narrow seam where the armor segments connected through an interlocking mechanism rated to resist forcible removal. She inserted her fingers into that gap and twisted. The helmet came free. Not cleanly. The locking mechanism resisted, and the sound of it failing was audible on the recording, a sharp cracking followed by the grind of deformed composite. She had overcome a military-grade locking mechanism with the grip strength of her bare hand. The soldier went down. She had his sidearm before his body hit the floor. She did not fire it. She used its weight and density as a striking instrument, driving the reinforced barrel into the faceplate of the adjacent soldier, with enough force to crack the ballistic glass across its full width. The second soldier staggered. The sidearm's biometric lock engaged, recognizing a non-authorized user, and the weapon shut down. Laura Simmons dropped it without hesitation. She had never intended to fire it. She had used a military sidearm as a blunt object because it was the heaviest thing within reach, and now it had served its purpose, and she did not need it anymore. She did not need it because she did not need any weapon. That realization settled into me during my 4th viewing and never left. Philip Grant hit the next cluster of soldiers from the opposite side. The first Vashon swung a suppression rod at his head. These rods were weighted composite instruments designed to deliver incapacitating neural shocks through powered armor. They were not delicate tools. They were designed to stop armored targets. Grant caught the rod mid-swing. I replayed this moment 9 times. His hand intercepted the rod at its midpoint, absorbed the momentum of the swing, and redirected the weapon in a single continuous motion that swept 2 soldiers off their feet simultaneously. The suppression rod was not designed to be used this way. It was a striking weapon, not a lever. Grant improvised a technique in the fraction of a second between the rod reaching his hand and the 2 soldiers hitting the ground. Then he dropped the rod and engaged the next group with his hands. I need to describe what happened to the 3rd soldier's armor, because it is the detail that permanently altered my understanding of what humans are. Vashon tactical armor is rated to withstand kinetic projectile impacts at velocities up to 400 meters per second. It is a layered composite material, reinforced at the structural joints, sealed against vacuum exposure and chemical penetration. It is, by any reasonable standard, among the most durable personal protection systems manufactured in the galaxy. Philip Grant found the elbow joint of the 3rd soldier's right arm and applied lateral force with his fingers. Not his fist, not a tool. His fingers, pressed against the articulation point where 2 armor segments connected, and he pushed. The joint buckled. The armor did not crack or shatter the way brittle material fails. It deformed, bending inward like soft metal under an industrial press. The structural composite, rated for ballistic impacts, yielded under the sustained grip force of a human hand. I ran the calculations later using the armor's published specifications. The force required to deform that joint exceeded anything that should have been possible for an unaugmented biological organism of Grant's mass. Philip Grant's file listed him as a career diplomat with a background in agricultural policy. He held a degree in soil management from a university on the human homeworld. He had never served in any military branch. He was a bureaucrat who worked on farming regulations, and he had just bent powered armor with his bare hands. Edward Cole and Margaret Webb moved in tandem, cutting through the opposite side of the formation. They did not fight the way Laura Simmons fought, with that fluid, almost surgical precision. They fought with raw, overwhelming physicality that relied on mass, momentum, and an understanding of leverage that seemed instinctive. Cole hit the first soldier at a dead sprint. The impact was devastating not because of his speed, which was considerable, but because of his commitment. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch as he closed the distance to a 200-kilogram armored target. He drove his shoulder into the soldier's midsection at the exact point where the chest plate met the abdominal segment, and the force of the collision carried both of them into the soldiers standing behind. 5 Veshan in full tactical armor went down in a cascading collapse, their formation discipline destroyed by the sheer physics of a 70-kilogram human body delivered with total conviction. Cole did not stop moving. He rolled off the first soldier, came up on his feet, and hit the next target before the soldier could raise his weapon. Every movement flowed into the next, with an efficiency that looked less like fighting and more like a natural process, like water finding its way downhill. Webb was equally devastating, but in a different way. She was the smallest of the 5 humans, a fact I noted because it made what she did even harder to reconcile with everything I thought I knew about physical capability. She grabbed a fallen suppression rod and used it as a lever, not a weapon. She wedged one end into the frame of a structural support column, planted her feet, and braced. When a charging soldier reached her, she pivoted the rod and redirected his momentum into the wall. The structural damage report I found later estimated the impact force at over 12,000 newtons. The reinforced wall panel cracked from floor to ceiling. Webb had generated that force using leverage, body positioning, and raw muscular output, and she had done it while standing on a smooth tile floor in formal diplomatic shoes. Her file listed her as an administrative assistant. Her job involved scheduling meetings and managing correspondence. I paused the recording at this point during my 7th viewing and stared at the frozen image of 5 humans standing in a room full of fallen soldiers. I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with the species profile I had memorized during my orientation. Minor species, unremarkable physiology, no natural weapons. The profile was not merely wrong. It was so wrong that it functioned as a kind of camouflage, a description so bland and dismissive that it obscured the reality behind it. Catherine Hale did not fight. She walked. While her 4 aides took apart 41 soldiers in powered armor, Ambassador Catherine Hale walked through the chaos, as if she were crossing a garden on a quiet afternoon. Soldiers fell around her. Armored bodies hit the floor. Weapons scattered across the tiles. Suppression rods discharged into empty air. And Catherine Hale walked, steady and unhurried and straight, directly toward Commander Torek. Torek was reaching for his sidearm. He was the commanding officer, the largest Vashan in the room, encased in the heaviest grade of tactical armor available to his species. His hand closed around the grip of his weapon and began to draw it from the magnetic holster on his hip. Catherine Hale reached him first. She did not run. She did not lunge. She simply arrived at his position, at the precise moment his weapon cleared the holster, and she placed her left hand on his right wrist. Just placed it there, the way you might rest your hand on a railing. "You have made an error," she said. Then she squeezed. The sound was captured clearly by the room's audio sensors. It was a compressed, wet sound, like dense wood splitting under sustained pressure. Torek's wrist broke inside his armor gauntlet. Not the armor itself, the biological structure within it, crushed by a grip that found the narrow gap between the gauntlet plate and the forearm segment, and applied force that the limb could not withstand. The weapon fell, Torek fell, and the room fell silent. 11 seconds, the timestamp confirmed it, from Catherine Hale's nod to the last Veshan soldier hitting the floor. 41 soldiers in powered armor, armed with military-grade weapons, supported by an active containment field, operating in a fortified room that had been specifically prepared for this confrontation. 11 seconds. 5 unarmed civilians in formal clothing. Not a single human was injured. Not a scratch. Not a bruise. Not a torn sleeve. I turned off the terminal after my 6th complete viewing and sat in the dark. But I was not done. The footage was only the first file on Suvan's chip. There was more. According to the records she had preserved, Ambassador Catherine Hale walked out of that conference room 11 minutes after the confrontation. She did not rush. She did not attempt to flee the building or barricade herself in a secure location. She straightened her diplomatic uniform, which was slightly wrinkled but otherwise undamaged. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She gathered her 4 aides, none of whom showed any sign of physical exertion, and she walked through the corridors of the council building to the general chamber. She arrived at the main entrance, presented herself to the startled security staff, and requested an emergency session under Article 9 of the Council Charter, the provision that allowed any ambassador to demand an immediate hearing in cases of sovereign threat. The security staff processed her request. She was granted the floor within 40 minutes. 700 delegates from more than 300 species watched Catherine Hale walk to the speaker's platform. Most of them had already heard rumors about something happening on the diplomatic level. A few had seen the Veshan soldiers being carried out on medical transports. None of them knew the full story. Catherine Hale stood at the platform and delivered a statement. The full transcript was sealed under Protocol Sigma, along with everything else, but Suvan's chip contained a partial copy, roughly 60% of the original text. I read it word by word, sitting in my darkened apartment with the glow of the terminal, the only light. And each sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. She did not threaten. She did not demand reparations or call for sanctions against the Vishan Dominion. She did not raise her voice, or display anger, or make any gesture that could be interpreted as aggressive. She did something far more devastating than any of those things. She explained what humans were. She began with evolutionary biology. Humanity, she told the chamber, had evolved on a world that galactic surveys classified as a Category 7 death world. High gravity, relative to the galactic median, an extreme axial tilt that produced violent seasonal variation, an oxygen-rich atmosphere that accelerated metabolic processes and supported sustained high-energy output across biological systems, persistent tectonic instability, ocean coverage exceeding 70%, with weather systems capable of generating sustained winds at speeds that most species classified as natural disasters. Predator biodiversity in the 96th percentile of all surveyed biospheres. She explained that humans were persistence predators, a classification so rare in the galactic biological record that most delegates had never encountered the term. Humans did not ambush their prey. They did not trap it, or poison it, or overwhelm it with speed or numbers. They followed it. They walked after it, hour after hour, day after day, across open terrain under a burning star, until the target animal's body failed from exhaustion and heat stress, and then the humans caught it, with their hands. She described the human adrenal response in clinical detail. When a human perceives a threat, the body initiates an involuntary chemical cascade that floods the muscular and nervous systems with compounds that dramatically increase strength, speed, reaction time, and pain tolerance. She listed specific multipliers. Strength output could increase by a factor of 3. Pain reception could be suppressed almost entirely. Cognitive processing narrowed to a single focus, eliminating hesitation, doubt, and fear. She noted that this response was not voluntary. It was not a skill that could be trained, or a technique that could be learned. It was a biological reflex encoded into every human's genetic architecture, triggered automatically by the perception of confinement, threat, or danger to self or others. She described human skeletal structure, bone density that exceeded the galactic median by a factor of 3.2. A skeletal framework optimized for both precision manipulation and catastrophic force application. A spinal column engineered by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to absorb, redirect, and amplify kinetic energy. She described human musculature, fast twitch fiber density that enabled explosive bursts of speed and power, slow twitch endurance fibers that allowed sustained physical output over periods that the chamber's own medical advisory panel later described as exceeding the physiological models of every other known species. She noted that human muscles were capable of self-repair at a rate that most species would classify as regenerative, rebuilding damaged tissue stronger than before, through a process that humans considered so ordinary they had a casual word for it. They called it exercise. She described the human immune system, a biological warfare engine so aggressive that it sometimes attacked the body's own tissue because it ran out of external threats to fight. She described human healing, the ability to seal open wounds with clotted blood, to knit broken bones back together within weeks, to recover from injuries that would be permanently disabling for most galactic species. She described human temperature regulation, the ability to operate across a range of environmental conditions that would incapacitate any other known bipedal species, from frozen tundra to scorching desert. She described the human brain, a pattern recognition engine that could process spatial geometry, predict trajectories, and calculate force vectors in real time during physical confrontation. A decision-making apparatus that could evaluate complex tactical situations and commit to a course of action in fractions of a second, and a social coordination system so sophisticated that 5 humans who had never trained for combat together could fight as a synchronized unit based solely on a single nod from their leader. And then she said the thing that, according to 3 separate accounts in the archive, caused the general chamber to go completely silent for the first time in its institutional history. What you witnessed today was not a military operation. It was not special forces. It was not an elite strike team, or a trained combat unit of any kind. My delegation consists of a diplomat, an agricultural policy advisor, a cultural studies specialist, a communications officer, and an administrative assistant. We are your counterparts. We are the equivalent of your clerks and your aides and your note-takers. Every human you have ever met in this building possesses these capabilities. Every human on our homeworld possesses these capabilities. This is not training. This is not augmentation. This is what we are. The biometric data from the chamber's environmental sensors was included in the archive. I checked Catherine Hale's readings at the moment she delivered that final statement. Heart rate, 62 beats per minute. Respiratory rate, 14 breaths per minute. Cortisol levels within standard baseline parameters. She was not stressed. She was not performing. She was reciting facts about her own biology, with the same calm precision a scientist would use to describe the chemical composition of water. The emergency session continued for another 7 hours after her statement. I could not access the full proceedings, but the records that survived in Suvan's archive showed the outcome clearly enough. The Council did not simply vote down the Veshan's security containment protocol. They dissolved the Veshan Dominion's military bloc in its entirety, stripping the 3 constituent species of their collective security authorization and imposing a 50-year ban on joint military operations. The Veshan's senior delegates were censured and removed from their committee assignments. Their fleet access to Council space was restricted to civilian shipping lanes. And the Council passed the resolution. Protocol Sigma, the classified measure that explained everything I had been trying to understand since the morning I watched a human ambassador walk past my checkpoint. But there was more. The resolution had 2 clauses, and I had only found evidence of the first. The exemption from security screening was clear. The second clause was referenced in construction documents and engineering reports, but never directly stated. Something else had been decided. Something else had been built. And I needed to find out what it was. I returned to the administrative archives with a new focus. I was no longer looking for what the Council had decided about humans. I was looking for what they had built for them. The corridor, the one the humans used every morning. It had not always existed. The Council building's original architectural plans showed a standard security entrance on the east side, identical to the other 11 entry points around the chamber's perimeter. Bioscanners, weapon detectors, guard stations, checkpoint barriers. But 40 years ago, that entrance had been demolished and replaced with something entirely different. I tracked down the construction records. They were not classified, which surprised me. They were simply filed in a section of the building archives that nobody visited. Physical documentation on a sublevel that still used hard copy storage. I spent an entire rest day in that dusty room, reading through engineering specifications and material requisitions and project timelines. The new corridor had been commissioned within 72 hours of the emergency session. There was no competitive bidding process, no public announcement, no committee debate. The construction order was signed by the senior delegate of every single council species, every one. 312 signatures on a single document, authorizing the demolition of a standard security checkpoint and its replacement with something that the engineering brief described as a low-stimulus transitional environment. I needed to know what that meant, and I needed to talk to someone who had built it. It took me 2 days to find Orath. He was a retired Belvon structural engineer who had worked on council building maintenance for most of his professional life. His name appeared on every construction report, every materials requisition, every inspection certificate associated with the corridor project. He was living in a modest residential unit on the 4th ring of the station, spending his retirement cultivating fungal gardens and watching freight ships dock through his observation window. He was old, blunt, and surprisingly willing to talk, which I had not expected. "The corridor," he said, settling into a chair across from me, with a cup of something that smelled like heated minerals. I have been waiting for someone to ask me about the corridor for about 12 years now. The last one was a Sutha journalist who gave up when she could not get anyone else to confirm what I told her. He took a long sip and studied me with the steady, appraising gaze of someone who has spent a lifetime building things that needed to endure. "The other checkpoints in the council building are designed around a simple principle," he said. "Identify threats, remove threats, Allow entry. You scan for weapons, you take them away, you let the delegate through. It is the same logic you would use to design a gate for any secure facility. He set his cup down. The human corridor is designed around the opposite principle. It does not remove anything. It adds something. Specifically, it adds the conditions under which humans are least likely to become what they are capable of becoming. I asked him to explain. After the Vashon incident, the council brought in human psychologists, not diplomats, not military analysts, psychologists. Specialists in something the humans call autonomic stress response. These specialists sat down with a panel of council architects and security advisors, and they explained something that no galactic survey had ever identified, because no survey had ever needed to ask the question. He held up one thick, calloused finger. When a human being perceives a threat, their body activates an involuntary physiological cascade. Muscles receive a surge of chemical energy. Pain reception is suppressed. Reaction speed increases. Cognitive processing narrows to a single objective: survive and neutralize. This is not a decision. It is not a skill. It is an automatic biological function that every single human being carries in their cellular architecture, inherited from millions of years of evolution on a death world. He held up a second finger. Scanners, weapons checks, armed guards, narrow corridors, checkpoint barriers, closed doors that lock behind you. These things communicate threat. To every other species in the Council, a security checkpoint signals safety. It says, "We have removed the danger. You are protected." To a human nervous system, a security checkpoint signals something entirely different. It says, "You are entering a controlled space. You are being assessed as a potential threat. Violence is expected in this environment. Prepare." He put his hand down and looked at me with an expression that was simultaneously matter-of-fact and deeply weary. "Do you understand now? You scan a Torvon to take away the danger they carry. You do not scan a human because scanning them creates the danger. The security is not serving the same function. For every other species, the checkpoint makes the chamber safer. For humans, the checkpoint makes it more dangerous." The logic was elegant, and it was terrifying. The entire security exemption was not a privilege granted to humanity out of respect or political leverage. It was a containment protocol designed to prevent the activation of the exact biological capabilities that the Vaishan had discovered the hard way. "Tell me about the corridor itself," I said. Orath leaned back and folded his arms. Every element was specified by the human psychologists. The width is 3 times the standard corridor measurement, because humans experience elevated stress responses in confined spaces. The ceiling height is double the building norm, because overhead clearance affects their threat assessment. Something about sight lines and escape route evaluation that happens below conscious awareness. The lighting is calibrated to the exact spectrum of their home star, because familiar light wavelengths reduce the production of stress hormones. He paused, as if remembering something specific. There are live plants along both walls. I had to source them from a botanical supplier on the human's nearest colony world. Specific species, chosen for their visual similarity to vegetation on Earth. The temperature is maintained within a precise 2-degree range that the psychologists identified as the human physiological comfort optimum. There is even a faint background audio layer, barely perceptible, mimicking natural environmental sounds from their homeworld. Running water, wind through leaves. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that a builder gives when describing a project that keeps him up at night. "We built them a garden," he said. "A beautiful, welcoming, perfectly engineered garden. And we did it because the alternative was building a fortress that would not have been strong enough anyway." I left Orath's quarters and walked back to my own, in something close to a daze, but I was not finished. There were more pieces to find, and each one was more disturbing than the last. That evening, I returned to the physical archives and continued pulling records. I was looking for anything from the weeks following the resolution that did not fit normal administrative patterns. And I found it, not in the construction files, not in the security logs, in the medical division's equipment procurement records. 3 weeks after the resolution was passed, The Council's medical division had placed an order for a new type of pharmaceutical compound. The order was small, just a few hundred doses, but the compound itself was unusual. It was a fast-acting sedative, custom formulated to work specifically on human neurochemistry. The order was flagged as a standing requisition, to be maintained in perpetuity, with supplies refreshed every standard year. The delivery address was not the medical division. It was the security office adjacent to the human corridor. I sat in that dusty archive room and felt the implications settle over me like cold water. The corridor was designed to keep humans calm. The plants, the lighting, the open space, the background audio, all of it was carefully calibrated to produce a specific psychological state: comfort, relaxation, safety. But the Council had not stopped there. They had also prepared for the possibility that the engineering might fail, that something might happen, some unexpected provocation, some diplomatic crisis, some moment of perceived threat, that overwhelmed the corridor's carefully calibrated environment and triggered the very biological response that the entire system was designed to prevent. Somewhere in the walls of that beautiful, welcoming garden, there were dispensers loaded with fast-acting sedative gas, custom formulated for human neurochemistry, maintained and refreshed every standard year for 4 decades, tested quarterly, according to the maintenance logs, and never once activated. 40 years of readiness, 40 years of careful preparation, for something that had never happened, and that the Council prayed would never happen. The Council had built 2 concentric layers of defense. The first layer was comfort, the second was chemistry. And the fact that they maintained both, investing resources and personnel, year after year across 4 decades, told me everything I needed to know about how seriously 300 species took the threat that a single uncomfortable human represented to everyone in the building. There was one more piece. During my research into the corridor's construction, I had found a discrepancy. 3 times in the 40 years since the resolution was passed, individual species had attempted to challenge or revoke the human security exemption. All 3 challenges had been withdrawn within days of being raised. No formal proceedings, no committee votes, no public debate, just quiet, rapid retractions. 2 of the 3 species refused my interview requests entirely. The third, a retired Kelvari senator named Councillor Tavik, agreed to meet me, though he insisted we meet in a public transit lounge where there were plenty of witnesses. Tavik was old, his scales faded to a dull bronze, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. "I raised the objection 12 years ago," he said, his voice low despite the public setting. "I had been a senator for 20 years. I understood galactic politics. I had negotiated trade agreements that spanned entire sectors. I believed I understood power." He folded his hands in his lap. "My argument was that the exemption violated the principle of equal treatment under Council law. If one species was excused from security screening, any species could claim the same right, and the entire security apparatus would collapse. I presented this argument at a closed committee session attended by 40 delegates and the human ambassador." "What happened?" I asked. "The human ambassador listened," Tavik said. His name was Leonard Harwood, a small man, quiet, gray hair, soft voice, the kind of person who disappears in a room full of louder personalities. He sat through my entire argument without interrupting. When I finished, he thanked me for raising the issue. He said he genuinely appreciated the principle behind my concern and agreed that equal treatment was a cornerstone of Council governance. Tavik's scales shifted color, taking on a pale quality that indicated deep discomfort. Then he asked, very politely, if I would like a practical demonstration of why the policy exists. He said the word demonstration, the way you might offer someone a glass of water, casual, friendly, as though what he was offering was the most ordinary thing in the galaxy. "Did you accept?" "I did not," Tavik said, because when he made the offer, he smiled. And I have spent 12 years trying to describe that smile to people who were not in the room, and I have never been able to do it justice. It was not aggressive. It was not a threat display. It was warm and genuine and completely sincere. He was honestly, without any pretense, offering to show me what a human being is capable of doing in close quarters without weapons. He looked out at the docking bay, where a freight hauler was locking into its berth with slow, careful precision. The smile was terrifying because it was kind. A threatening smile I could have dismissed as posturing. A cold smile I could have interpreted as bluff. But a kind smile, an offer made with genuine warmth from a man who already knows the outcome, that is something else entirely. That is a person who bears you no ill will, and is still absolutely certain that what he can show you will change your mind. And it did, I said. I withdrew my objection the following morning. I told the committee I had reconsidered the legal foundations. That was a lie. I withdrew because of a smile from a quiet man with gray hair who made me understand, in a single moment of genuine kindness, that I was sitting across the table from something I had fundamentally failed to comprehend. I returned to my quarters that evening and sat for a long time without turning on the lights. My investigation was complete. I had the footage, the testimony, the construction records, the procurement files for sedative gas that had been maintained for 4 decades, and the account of a veteran politician who had abandoned a principled position because a soft-spoken diplomat had offered him a cup of truth, and he had been wise enough to decline it. I tried to organize what I had learned into some kind of coherent framework. I was an administrator. Organization was what I did. But this knowledge resisted categorization. It was too large, too fundamental, too alien to my previous understanding of how the galaxy worked. I had grown up believing that civilization was built on the principle that violence could be contained, regulated, and controlled through institutional mechanisms. Security checkpoints, legal frameworks, military deterrence. The entire architecture of galactic governance rested on the assumption that threats could be identified, measured, and neutralized through systems of sufficient sophistication. The humans broke that assumption. They were not a threat that could be confiscated at a door. They were not a weapon that could be locked in a cabinet. They were a species whose baseline biological capability exceeded the combat potential of every other known sentient being, and that capability was woven so deeply into their physical architecture that removing it would require dismantling the species itself. You could not disarm a human any more than you could disarm a hurricane. You could only make sure it had no reason to form. The next morning, I went back to my checkpoint. I logged in, pulled up my manifest, and watched the delegations begin to arrive. The Orini submitted to their bioscan. The Melori deactivated their psionic dampeners. The Torvans surrendered their ceremonial blades. Species after species, delegation after delegation, filing through their checkpoints, submitting to their searches, having their weapons cataloged and secured. Then Diana Pierce walked through her corridor. She was carrying a leather-bound notebook in one hand and a ceramic cup of coffee in the other. Steam rose from the cup in lazy curls. Her pace was unhurried, her posture relaxed, her expression open and pleasant. She glanced through the glass partition that separated her corridor from the main security area, saw me watching, and smiled. She raised her cup in a small gesture of greeting. I waved back. She disappeared through the chamber door, still holding her coffee, still completely at ease, still carrying nothing but a notebook and a warm drink. I turned back to my console, and my hearts were hammering, not from fear, from understanding. Because I now saw what I had been blind to for weeks, the way other species moved around her, the subtle adjustments in posture and position that happened whenever a human delegate was nearby. The Torvan guard at the corridor entrance stood at ease, but never turned his back. The Melori attendant who maintained the corridor's plants worked with efficient silence, always aware of when the humans were approaching, always stepping aside well before she needed to. Even the automated systems seemed calibrated around the human schedule, the corridor's climate controls warming to the optimum temperature exactly 8 minutes before the delegation typically arrived, as though the building itself was preparing to greet them. I had mistaken all of this for courtesy. Now I saw it for what it was. A few weeks passed after that morning. I settled into a rhythm at the checkpoint. I processed delegations, maintained my equipment, filed my reports. I watched Diana Pierce walk through her corridor every morning, and I waved, and she waved back, and the galaxy continued to turn. Some days the knowledge sat quietly in the background of my awareness. Other days, it pressed against the inside of my skull with a weight that made concentration difficult. And then the Dreth arrived, and everything changed. The Dreth Combine was a recently unified coalition from the Outer Reach, a region of space that had been largely unmapped until the last 2 decades. They had applied for council membership with the swagger of a species that had conquered its local neighborhood and assumed the rest of the galaxy would be impressed. Their delegation came through my checkpoint at mid-morning, 20 individuals, each standing over 2 meters tall, covered in dense exoskeletal plating that served as natural armor. They carried ceremonial blades and sidearms within the legal allowance, and they submitted to the scanning process with loud, visible impatience. One of them knocked a bioscanner off its mounting bracket while turning around in the checkpoint lane, and when the technician asked him to stand still, the Dreth looked down at her and made a sound in his throat that my translator could not process but my instincts interpreted without difficulty. Their lead delegate was named Harsk. He was the tallest of the group, with a ridge of bony protrusions running from his forehead to the back of his skull that made him look like a battering ram that had evolved the ability to talk. He spoke loudly, stood too close to everyone he addressed, and radiated the particular confidence of someone who has never met anything he could not intimidate. When I scanned his credentials, he leaned over my console and watched the process with an expression that suggested he was evaluating whether the equipment was worth destroying. "Efficient," he said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. I processed them through without comment and went back to my station. But I did not relax. Something about the Dreth set off a signal in the back of my mind, a pattern recognition that I had developed over weeks of studying the Council's unspoken rules. The Dreth did not know those rules. They did not know what I knew. And species that did not know what I knew had a tendency to make mistakes that could not be taken back. The ratification hearing was scheduled for the afternoon. The preliminary session was in the morning. I should not have watched the broadcast feed, but I could not look away. Harsk took the speaker's platform for his opening statement. It was a recitation of military conquests, territorial holdings, and economic output, delivered at a volume that made the audio sensors clip. Midway through his remarks, he noticed the human delegation seated in their section, and he noticed the door they had entered through. The door without a checkpoint. He stopped his prepared speech. "I observe," he said, his voice filling the chamber like a blunt instrument, "that the human delegation enters this room through a private corridor. No screening, no weapons inspection, no guard presence. Is this a privilege of rank, or is it something else?" The chamber went silent, not gradually, instantly. 700 delegates from 300 species stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped breathing, for a moment that stretched like a wire pulled too tight. I watched the faces on the broadcast feed. I saw fear, not the sharp, immediate fear of a sudden threat, the deep, cold fear of someone watching a stranger walk toward a precipice they cannot see. Diana Pierce looked up from her notebook. She set down her pen. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her. Her face showed nothing but polite attention. Her body showed nothing but stillness. Harsk took the silence as encouragement. "Where I come from," he continued, "those who refuse to submit to the same rules as everyone else are either cowards or believe themselves above the laws they expect others to follow. Which is it for the humans?" I gripped the edge of my console hard enough to feel the metal press into my palms. Diana Pierce did not speak. She did not need to, because I recognized the expression on her face. I had seen it on a recording made 40 years before this moment, on the face of a woman named Catherine Hale, 1 second before she gave a nod that changed galactic history. Calm, not suppressed anger, not controlled fear. The complete, total, biological calm of a human being who has assessed her environment and determined that nothing in it constitutes a threat. And that was what made it terrifying, because if she was not threatened, she was choosing to remain still. The danger was not in what happened when she reacted. The danger was in knowing she could react at any moment, and that nothing in the chamber, no weapon, no armor, no guard, no dampening field, would be enough to contain what happened next. Before she could respond, 6 delegates from 6 different species rose from their seats simultaneously. The Torvan ambassador stood first, his massive frame unfolding from his chair with a deliberation that carried more authority than any words. The Mellery representative followed, then the Belvan, the Kelvari, the Sutha, and the Orinai. 6 species, 6 political traditions, 6 histories of disagreement and rivalry, and they all stood together, united by a shared understanding that Harsk did not possess. I watched the other delegates in the chamber. The ones who remained seated did not look confused by this display. They looked relieved. Several nodded silently. A Pelian representative in the 3rd tier closed his eyes briefly, as if in gratitude. They all knew what was happening. They all understood the purpose. The 6 who stood were not protecting the human delegation from the Dreth. They were protecting the Dreth from the human delegation. And they were protecting every other species in the room from what would happen if a human delegate decided that the chamber was no longer a safe place to be. The Torvan ambassador spoke. His voice was controlled, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Delegate Harsk, the Dreth Combine is a guest in this chamber. Guests do not question house rules that they do not understand. The human security arrangement is a matter of established council policy. It will not be discussed in open session. I have asked a simple question, Harsk said. He drew himself up to his full height, his natural armor plates flaring slightly in a dominance display. I expect a simple answer. And I am giving you something far better than an answer, the Torvan ambassador replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his posture. He simply stood and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who has been carrying a specific piece of knowledge for a long time and has learned exactly how much weight it carries. I am giving you a courtesy that you have not earned and do not deserve. You will step down from that platform. You will follow me to the anteroom, and you will listen to what I tell you. This is not a suggestion. The chamber was absolutely silent. 700 delegates watched this exchange without moving, without speaking, barely breathing. The air felt compressed, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I watched Harsk calculate. He was a military commander, trained in dominance hierarchies and threat assessment. He did not understand a room that operated on knowledge he did not have. He glanced at the human delegation. Diana Pierce was still sitting with her hands folded, still calm, still looking at him with that expression of polite, patient attention. She had not moved a muscle since the confrontation began. She had not spoken a word. And somehow that stillness was more intimidating than anything Harsk had ever encountered on a battlefield. Something in the Torvan's tone must have penetrated, or perhaps it was something in Diana Pierce's quiet, unblinking gaze, because after a long, charged moment, Harsk stepped down from the platform and followed the ambassador out of the chamber. They were gone for 20 minutes. I counted every second on my console clock. I do not know what the Torvan ambassador told him. I do not know if he showed footage or presented data, or simply described in words what 5 unarmed humans had done in 11 seconds to 41 soldiers in powered armor. I have imagined that conversation many times since, and every version I construct in my mind ends the same way, with Harsk standing in a small room, hearing something that dismantles his entire understanding of where his species fits in the hierarchy of physical capability. When Harsk returned to the chamber, he was a different creature. The aggressive posture had evaporated. The booming voice was gone. The predatory confidence that had filled the room when he first took the platform had been replaced by something I had never seen in a Dreth before, something that looked very much like the careful, measured movements of a species that has just discovered it is not the most dangerous thing in its environment. He moved to his delegation's section and sat down without speaking. His fellow delegates leaned toward him, clearly expecting a debrief. He said nothing to them. For the remainder of the session, he did not look in the direction of the human delegation, not once. When a Belvan delegate walked past the human section during a recess, Harsk physically turned his body away, as though proximity to the humans was itself a source of discomfort. His exoskeletal plating had changed color. It had shifted from the dark amber of confidence to the pale, washed-out gray that indicated acute physiological distress in Dreth biology. This was not a voluntary display. Dreth coloration was tied to their autonomic nervous system. Harsk's body was broadcasting his fear to anyone who knew how to read it, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Whatever he had learned in that anteroom had not merely changed his political calculus. It had rewritten his body's assessment of the threat landscape. He had walked into the council chamber, believing he was the apex predator in the room. He had come back from the anteroom, knowing he was not even close. After the session ended, I stayed at my checkpoint. The delegations filed out. Diana Pierce walked through her corridor at her usual pace, notebook under her arm, empty coffee cup dangling from 2 fingers. She glanced through the glass and saw me. She waved. I waved back. Then Dren appeared at my station. He pulled a chair over and sat down next to me without asking permission, something he had never done before. "You know," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "The data chip, Suvan's copy." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He did not seem surprised or angry. He seemed tired. The kind of tired that accumulates over decades of carrying something heavy. "Every generation," he said, "someone finds out. Suvan believes it is important that the knowledge survives. I used to disagree. I used to think it was safer buried. But today proved her right. Someone has to understand why the rule exists, so that when a new species walks in and asks the obvious question, there is someone who can make sure the answer does not become a disaster." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the monitors. Then he said something I had not expected. "I was like you once, young, meticulous, convinced that the system had a flaw that nobody else had noticed. I found out about the humans in my 3rd year here. Suvan gave me the same chip she gave you. I watched the same footage, and I spent the next decade trying to convince myself that what I had seen was exaggerated, or misrepresented, or somehow less significant than it appeared." He shook his head slowly. "It was not. The footage is exactly what it looks like, and the reality is exactly as concerning as the footage suggests. I have spent 27 years sitting at this checkpoint knowing what walks through that corridor every morning, and I have never once become comfortable with the knowledge. But I have learned to use it. I have learned to understand that my discomfort is the correct response, and that the correct response to my discomfort is to keep doing exactly what the protocol requires. Keep the humans comfortable. Keep them safe. Keep them smiling." He looked at me. "The footage. How many times did you watch the 11 seconds? 32, I said. He almost smiled. "I watched it 47 times. It does not stop being remarkable." We sat together for a moment, watching the monitors cycle through their feeds. The corridor was empty now, the plants swaying gently, the warm light pooling on the polished floor. "There is one more thing," Dren said. "Something that Suvan may not have shown you." He pulled a data tablet from his uniform and handed it to me. On the screen was a document stamped with the seal of the Council's Defense Analysis Committee. 3 years after the Veshon incident, Dren said, the Council commissioned a full biological threat assessment of humanity. Not military capability. Biology. They wanted to understand exactly what they were dealing with, at the species level. I read the summary. It was written in the dry, precise language of scientific analysis. It was 300 pages long, compiled by xenobiologists from 12 different species, using data from human medical archives, athletic performance records, and direct physiological testing. The panel had spent 2 years conducting their evaluation, with the full cooperation of the human government, which had provided access to medical databases, military fitness records, and even civilian health statistics. The humans had cooperated because they saw no reason not to. They did not consider their biology classified information. They shared it freely, openly, with a transparency that the panel initially interpreted as confidence and later reclassified as something more unsettling. The humans were not being generous by sharing their data. They simply did not regard their own capabilities as extraordinary. To them, this was normal. This was what a body did. They were baffled by the panel's astonishment in the same way that a fish might be baffled by someone expressing amazement that it could swim. The summary was 1 page. A single, unarmed, untrained human in a state of full adrenal response represented a greater close-quarters physical threat than any individual of any other council species, armored or unarmored, augmented or natural. This was not a theoretical projection. It was an empirical finding, tested, measured, and replicated across multiple controlled scenarios. Trained humans exceeded that baseline by orders of magnitude that the panel specifically declined to quantify, stating that the upper limits of human physical capability under adrenal stress conditions had not been established and might not have a practical ceiling. Every human being alive carried this potential in their biology, every single one. The elderly professor, the child, the administrative assistant who had cracked a wall panel with a redirected soldier, the agricultural policy advisor who had bent powered armor, the quiet ambassador with the gray hair and the kind smile. The final page contained the second clause of the resolution, the recommendation that had been adopted word for word into Protocol Sigma. I read it, and each word settled into my understanding with the weight of something permanent. Do not disarm them. Do not search them. Do not restrict them. Do not, under any circumstances, give them reason to believe they are in danger. The security of the Council is best served by ensuring that humanity's delegates feel welcomed, respected, and safe. A comfortable human is a peaceful human. This is not diplomacy. This is survival. I handed the tablet back to Dren. My hands were steady only because I was consciously willing them to be. The first clause is a policy, Dren said. The second clause is a confession. The Council does not exempt humans from screening because it respects them, though it does. It does not exempt them because it fears them, though it does. It exempts them because 300 species looked at the biological data and arrived at the same conclusion independently. You cannot make them safe by disarming them, because they cannot be disarmed. They are the weapon. The only variable you can control is whether the weapon activates. And the best way to prevent activation is to make sure they never feel the need. He stood up. Welcome to the Protocol Enforcement Division, Keth. You are now one of a small number of people in every generation who understands the most important security protocol in the history of the Galactic Council. Do your job, process your delegations, maintain your checkpoints, and every morning when the human ambassador walks through her corridor, you smile, and you wave, and you make absolutely sure that she feels at home. He walked away. I sat at my console and stared at the monitor showing the human corridor. It was empty and quiet, the engineered breeze stirring the leaves of plants imported from a distant death world, the warm light falling across a floor that had been polished to a welcoming shine. It looked peaceful. It looked beautiful. It looked like exactly what it was, the most important piece of architecture in the Council building. A corridor designed by 300 species, working together with a unity of purpose they had never achieved on any other project, united not by shared ideals or common ambition, but by a shared understanding of what walked through it every morning. I sat there for a long time after my shift ended, watching that empty corridor on the monitor. I thought about the layers of what I had learned, each one building on the last like geological strata, each one deeper and more foundational than the one above it. The first layer was the exemption itself. A rule that seemed like a privilege, until you understood it, was a precaution. The second layer was the corridor. A garden that seemed like hospitality until you understood it was engineering. The third layer was the resolution. A policy document that seemed like diplomacy until you read the second clause and understood it was a survival strategy written by 300 species who had looked at the biological data and arrived at the same conclusion independently. And the fourth layer, the deepest one, the one that I would carry with me for the rest of my life, was the simplest and the most unsettling. The humans did not know. They walked through their garden every morning and saw a pleasant corridor. They waved at the guards and saw friendly colleagues. They entered the chamber and saw a workplace. They had no idea that the entire building had been redesigned around their biology, that 300 species held their breath every time a human delegate frowned too deeply, that the comfortable temperature and the pleasant lighting and the welcoming plants were not amenities but countermeasures built by a galaxy that had learned, in 11 seconds of footage, what it meant to share the stars with a species forged on a death world. The humans thought they were being treated well because the galaxy was polite. They did not realize they were being treated well because the galaxy was terrified. And that, I came to understand, was perhaps the most effective security measure of all. Because a human who knows they are feared might start to wonder why. A human who starts wondering is a human whose calm begins to develop cracks. And a human with cracked calm is exactly what the corridor was built to prevent. Better to let them walk through their garden. Better to let them hum their songs and drink their coffee and wave at the security clerks through the glass. Better to keep them comfortable and happy and blissfully unaware of the infrastructure of caution that surrounded them at every moment of every day they spent in the most important building in the galaxy. I thought about Catherine Hale, straightening her collar in a room full of fallen soldiers with a resting heart rate of 62 beats per minute. I thought about Leonard Harwood, offering a demonstration with a smile so genuine and so kind that a veteran senator had abandoned a principled position rather than see what came next. I thought about Harsk, who had entered the council chamber believing he was the most formidable thing in the room, and left it 20 minutes later, with his confidence dismantled and his body chemistry rewritten by knowledge he could never unlearn. And I thought about Diana Pierce, who walked through a garden every morning, humming a melody I did not recognize, carrying nothing but a notebook and a cup of coffee, waving at a security clerk through a glass partition with the easy warmth of someone who felt completely and absolutely safe. She walked past my checkpoint every morning after that, always smiling, always relaxed, always carrying nothing but that notebook and her coffee. And every morning, I smiled back and felt my heart's hammering in my chest, not because I was afraid of her, but because I understood what her comfort meant. It meant we were safe. The moment she stopped smiling would be the moment none of us were.